Hello, I'm Matt Kofroth, Watershed Specialist for Lancaster County Conservation District, and this will be one in a series of training webinars or videos in regards to the Water Quality Volunteer Coalition. And this particular webinar will focus on habitat assessment training, which is a way to our volunteers assess the water quality by looking at the habitat in a particular stream for macroinvertebrates and also fish communities. This is also a assessment that the Department of Environmental Protection does along with EPA. So we're using protocols that state and federal agencies are using, and our volunteers are now using as well. This protocol is used usually once or twice a year by our volunteers, but the idea of this training is really to go through what we're to be looking for when you're doing this particular training exercise. So we'll get right into this. So the stream habitat assessment and field data sheet is really painting a picture of what the aquatic community looks like, not necessarily in the stream, but the habitat around that stream. Is it conducive for really good aquatic habitat and land use practices that would mean that potentially the water quality in that particular area is improving, or at least has pretty good indications of good water quality. The purpose is, like I said, to assess the physical habitat, describe the stream bottom, the sides, surrounding areas, and physical characteristics. Basically, they have a direct impact on the fish and the macroinvertebrates in that particular area. And that's really what this data sheet and assessment is all about. So like I talked about earlier, there's two habitat evaluation field data sheets, one that DEP has and also EPA. The DEP one is called the Physical Habitat Evaluation Form, which is really looking for information out of riffles and runs in the stream. And there's also an EPA Rapid Bioassessment Habitat Form. They're both very, very similar, and I'll show you both of them. In fact, they have a lot of the same characteristics, but one has a few more questions than the other, and we'll be using the DEP evaluation form. There's a lot of words here, but the overall idea is that this is an approved DEP habitat evaluation. It was really modified from EPA's rapid bioassessment. It looks at 10 different parameters in the particular stream, where one looks at 12. The main purpose is to account for the limitations that are due to existing stream conditions. If there's habitat issues out there, this assessment will really point those out and kind of limit or kind of provide information and maybe what next steps should be. This is particularly important in cause and effect and cumulative impact studies. So we're looking at what is actually happening on the land and what is it doing to the particular stream that we're looking at. So that's really what the idea of this whole habitat assessment is all about. Physical habitat of the aquatic environment is a critical component. Therefore, the assessment of the physical habitat is performed in conjunction, typically with a biological assessment, which is another training video. The in-stream habitat availability and conditions is a major factor, as I talked about, in abundance and diversity of both macroinvertebrates, but also fish. We want a healthy and diverse aquatic community in these areas, which have boulders, cobble, woody debris, you name it. All those things, different flow regimes, and shallow and deep environments. We don't want silts and sediments and sands that can actually reduce the cover and also the ability of some of those habitats for some of our aquatic insects, and that can impair the particular section of stream. To assess the flowing surface waters, DEP does a physical habitat whenever possible. Like I said, we do it twice a year. This method is used to collect important information, and the protocol is set up in the monitoring book that can be found on DEP's website. Like I said, there are two habitat assessment protocols based on flow regimes, DEP habitat for high gradient streams, and then semi-wadable ones, water dominated by riffle run. That's what one we'll be using, is based on habitat assessment. This habitat evaluates 12 parameters and then a scoring system of 20-point scoring method, and we'll go over all this. The method for low gradient streams and rivers, waters that lack riffles, these are larger water bodies typically, is based on the habitat assessment and physiochemical parameters described in Barber's book as well. But we will not be talking about that during this assessment. So the threshold we're really looking for this habitat assessment is a score of 140. Is really what we're looking for. Anything above that means we have pretty good water quality. If we're below that, we probably have some issues and might not be the best stream. Certain in-stream and riparian area habitat parameters are strong predictors, and we'll talk about those. Things like embeddedness, sediment deposition, condition of banks, and even the bank vegetation. The impairment threshold for the parameters of embeddedness, sediment deposition, or condition of the banks and bank vegetation is a total score of 24 or less. And once again, we'll go into that and what we'll be looking for those. So this is EPA's rapid bioassessment parameters. They only have 10. And this is what they're looking for. Anything from attachment sites to macros, embeddedness, shelter for fish, channel alteration, sediment deposition, stream velocity and depth, channel flow, bank vegetation, conditions of the bank, and the width of the riparian zone. What DEP has done is added 2 more parameters. But if you look at their categories, they're very, very similar. Anything with an asterisk is basically the same thing in the EPA. The only 2 that are different are really in-stream cover and the grazing or other disruptive pressures. So everything else is pretty much exactly the same as EPA's, just might have a different terminology. So that's why we're using the DEP one, just so we can factor in those other 2, because we do have grazing, and obviously we're looking for in-stream cover as well. So the physical description is scored as either optimal, suboptimal, marginal, or poor, and you get a range. So it's a very subjective test, but a fairly accurate one if you're doing it in a team approach. Within the optimal category, there's 20 to 16 points, suboptimal 15 to 11, marginal 10 to 6, and poor 5 to 0. The habitat form is a 1-pager front and back. It has 6 questions on the one side and 6 on the other. You're putting your water body name, your location, who's doing it, and then it goes into each parameter. And that's really what this screen is going to be about, going into each 12 of those parameters and looking at the particular habitat in question and where the optimal, suboptimal, marginal, and poor categories kind of fit into all these categories. Once again, on the back side are the other 6 questions, and we'll go over each one of these parameters going through this evaluation. So the first 4 questions, or first 4 evaluation questions, are really stream conditions in the immediate vicinity of where you'd be potentially doing a benthic macroinvertebrate sampling or a biological assessment. So right where you'll be sampling, these are where these first 4 questions kind of hit on. So the first one is in-stream cover. You're looking at the percent of makeup of the substrate, how many boulders, cobble, other rock materials, and submerged logs you might have that provide refuge for a fish or larger species or even benthic macroinvertebrates. We're looking for things that fish might live in or around, such as snags, logs, undercut banks. Any fisherman knows those are the best places to go fishing. If these things are found in 50% of the site, that's optimal. If these things are absent from the site or less than 10%, then the site is probably poor. So for all of these, we kind of go into an optimal and poor kind of situation and give you characteristics to look for. So on your left, there is an optimal situation where you can kind of see you got snags, you got some rocks, you got some things that are really optimal for in-stream cover for a fish. The poor area, you can kind of see, yeah, there's a couple cobble, but there's not much habitat. If I was a fisherman, if I was a macro, or if I was even a fish, I would not want to be in this particular section of stream. I would want to be over here. I have a lot more nooks and crannies to kind of hang out and look for. In the in-stream cover, once again, this is the optimal range. You're looking for that greater than 50% boulder mix of submerged logs, undercut banks. Maybe you don't have 50%. Maybe it's only 30 or 50%. Like I said, it's very subjective. So you're giving it a score in either that optimal range, that suboptimal. Maybe you only have 10 or 30%. Then you're in that marginal range, or maybe you're in that poor range. And what we want to do in this training is also give you kind of a little bit of a test as well on how you would particularly rate different sections. So we're going to throw out some other pictures to kind of go through what we would say, or maybe what your ideas would be for particular sections of stream. So for instance, for this one, just looking at in-stream cover, we're not looking at any other parameter, just in-stream cover. What would we rate this particular section? Will we rate it as optimal, suboptimal, marginal? And looking at it, we do have some snags here. Yes, we don't have any vegetation cover, but once again, we're just looking for in-stream cover. We have some snags here. We've got maybe some overhead cover. I don't know if I would put it maybe in the optimal range. It might be suboptimal or maybe marginal, and maybe in that range. What we want to do, though, And this is where the habitat assessment is really good, is looking at numerous sites. So if this we're saying suboptimal to marginal for this one, then what would we say for this one? Well, this one might be a little bit higher because we have woody debris, we have undercut roots, we have logs, we have rocks to kind of hang out and have areas for the fish and macros to have. So this one might be more of an optimal characteristic. Once again, the more sites you see, the more of that in-stream cover habitat or all these parameters are going to be better for you to kind of evaluate. And that's the general idea of this. Just looking at in-stream cover, this would probably be a little better than that last site we looked at. So epifaunal substrate. Epifaunal is a big fancy word. It evaluates the riffle quality relative to stream width and dominant substrate. So what do you have on the bottom is really what it comes down to. Attachment sites based on the amount of cobble versus the amount of gravel and sand. More cobble means more attachment sites for macros. Cobble is typically rock between 4 inches diameter or 12 inches. And we want wider, longer riffle run sections are favored. So we're looking for areas where these macros can hide under rocks and larger rocks. Once again, optimal would be something like this, where you have a lot of these rocks and pebbles and areas where they can actually hide underneath. So the substrate here, the epifaunal substrate, is really, really optimal. On this section, it's kind of hard to see, but it mostly looks like mud and sand and silt. There's a couple rocks here and there, but I would probably put this in more of the poor category, not the most ideal. Once again, in the optimal, we want well-developed riffle and runs, riffles as wide as the stream, and length extends 2 times the width of the stream abundance. So we're doing some rough calculations. Suboptimal will be the riffle is as wide as the stream, but length is less than 2 times. Marginal is run as riffles are not as wide, and it's less length and less than 2 times the stream. So you're, once again, each one is stepping down. So you're using this as kind of a subjective chart to kind of figure out where you might be in those ratios. So once again, let's look at this particular site. Once again, only for epifaunal kind of characteristics. So I see a lot of rocks here, a lot of opportunities. So this one might be in that optimal to suboptimal range. We have a lot of different opportunities for that substrate upstream and downstream. This one, maybe not. I mean, once again, we see it mostly silts and algae. Yeah, there's some things on the edge here, but this one would be more maybe the marginal or poor. The width is, yeah, maybe what we're looking for, but as far as the bottom is concerned, we really don't have that kind of substrate we're looking for to really be ideal for macros and fish. Embeddedness. This is probably one of the harder ones to gauge because remember, for this habitat assessment, you're typically not in the stream. You could, but you're typically not in. So you're judging it from the bank. But embeddedness evaluates the extent to which the rocks, snags are covered or sunken into the silt or sand or mud. And you sometimes can't see that staying on the bank. The rating of this parameter may be variable depending on where you're looking. Embeddedness is based on how entrenched the cobble is on other substrate materials. Is it easy to flip over a rock? If you've been in the stream, you can probably figure that out. If you haven't, it's a little bit harder. Observation embedment should be taken in the upstream and central portions of like a riffle and cobble substrate areas. So this is a kind of hard picture to see, but this is right out of the EPA program. So you can see here, these look like they're fairly easy to flip over these rocks. So that's probably in more of the optimal range. They're not embedded with a bunch of sediment around them. This one is a little bit harder to see, but you can kind of see some of the silt, some of those things that might embed and not allow you to easily flip over rocks. Once again, you're looking at the gravel, the cobble, the boulder, the particles, and 0 to 25% surrounded by fine sediment, 25 to 50 surrounded by sediment, 50 to 75, or 75 or more. So you're gauging what that looks like. This is a site you can maybe look at. It's kind of hard to see, but once again, are you in the stream or around the stream, and what can you see? Can you easily flip over these rocks? It potentially could, so maybe it's in the suboptimal to maybe marginal. I don't know if it would be 100% optimal because you do see quite a bit of silt and sand around here as well. Let's compare that to something like this, where I see a lot more rocks and things that maybe I could flip over. But once again, it's hard to see through pictures. It's much better if you're out in the site, maybe around, is there silt gathering around here that might be harder to pick those things up and the embeddedness of that particular area. So velocities and depth regime. These are fairly easy to assess, but something we don't always think about. Just like not everybody lives in a town or in an apartment, we all live in different environments. And macroinvertebrates and fish need different environment. They need different types of presence of those environments. And flow regime, they need fast and deep areas. They need fast and shallow. They need slow and deep, and they need slow and shallow. Do we have all four of those in our areas? So we need to find out if the particular stream we're looking at has all of those. So once again, we're looking for different characteristics in the stream. You see shallow and fast here. This looks like a shallow, excuse me, a deep and slow area. Up here, down here, looks like a more of a fast and shallow area. So we're looking for different characteristics because that's going to give us the more diversity of macros and fish communities. So we're looking at, does it have all four of them? Does it only have three of them? Does it have two of them? It's only dominated by one. And that's going to really gauge our evaluation of that particular site. This particular site is fairly easy to assess. I can see mostly probably deep and slow. Probably has that, maybe a little bit of fast and slow, but that's pretty much the only habitat I see in this area. Yes, it has a good buffer, but once again, we're only looking at the flow regime on this particular parameter, so it might not score as high, maybe more of a marginal. Where on this one, I can see quite a few different characteristics. I got fast, I've got some slow water down here. Looks like there's some deeper water here. Once again, knowing the area helps, but this might score a little bit higher than the last one, so maybe this is suboptimal compared to the last one, which is marginal or poor. So those are the first four parameters. Now we'll look at the next four. So the next four parameters really evaluate a larger area surrounding the sampled reach. This expanded area is the stream length defined by at least how far upstream the investigator can see and how far downstream you can see as well. But you want to try to get at least like 100 meters upstream of the sampled reach. So you're looking upstream as far as you can on both ways. So we're looking at channel alterations. Most of Pennsylvania streams have been altered in some way, but we're looking for more visible alterations. Excavation, channelization, dredging can include any large scale changes. Stream restoration could be that, but is it for the better is really what we're looking for. Channel alterations, when artificial embankments, riprap, and other forms of bank stabilization structures are present. Is it straight? Obviously, that's good. Are there dams there? Are there bridges present? Those kind of changes. If the channel has been altered by direct human activity, it will typically probably score low. Or is there good things such as good alterations, such as stream restoration or things like that? These are really extreme examples, but I mean, obviously this has probably not been altered too much. It looks like it has some eroded banks, but it's wooded, it's fairly not altered. Whereas this one, it looks like somebody just went down with a backhoe and just straightened the stream right down the pipe there. And really, that's all it was done. So probably a poor range. So once again, optimization. And no channel or dredging present. That's going to be hard to judge, like I said, because most streams are in Pennsylvania, at least in Lancaster, have been altered in some way, but using your best judgment. So there's been some channelization, new embankments, whatever it might be. Obviously, this one has probably been altered at some point. Concrete raceway, concrete channel, probably in the poor range, something has been done. But this one, it doesn't look too bad. Yes, we have some riprap here, but it doesn't look like it's been altered too much. I will tell you this site was actually a site for stream restoration. So maybe it's more on the suboptimal to marginal. It's not going to be ideal or optimal, but it might have some of this characteristic because once again, it was those good alterations that particularly took place in this area. So you're evaluating just that evaluation process. Sediment deposition. This estimates the extent of sediment effects in the formation of islands, point bars, pool deposition. We don't want too much sediment. We want that to be flowing through if there is sediment and those kind of issues. Where streams flow around bends or obstructions, do we have point bars or the result of sediment deposition? Little or no deposition obviously is optimal. Sediment deposition is not embeddedness. So we're not looking around the rocks, we're looking on the edges of where that sediment is being deposited. So this is a very good indication. These are poor indicators where that sediment is kind of being deposited in the middle or on the edges, where here, yeah, you have some cobble here, but it's mostly cobble. It's not the sediment and fine stuff. It looks like it's fairly good characteristics. So little or no enlargement of islands or point bars. We have some, depending on what you look at. Once again, the percentages are going up with the bottom affected by point bars or changes or sediment islands. So I don't see this as a site in Lancaster County. This one I don't see much deposition. Looks like fairly good. Might be more of an optimal to a suboptimal as compared to something like this, where we obviously have sediment deposition both on the inside bends, but also on point bars in the middle there as well. So this would be more of the marginal, the poor kind of a water quality. Regardless, in regards to other characteristics, like I said, we're only looking for this parameter at those point bars. This doesn't have a wider buffer than this one, but once again, only looking at sediment, this is what we're judging for this particular parameter. So riffle frequency is number 7, estimates the frequency of riffle occurrences based on stream width and diversity occurring in the stream, riffle run prevalence. So how many riffles and runs do we have, and what's that ratio? Once again, more habitat means more diversity in the macros and other things. So we have lots of different habitats here with lots of different flow regimes, where this one, I see maybe 2. I mean, there's not too many differences there in regards to those riffle frequencies. It looks like there's maybe 1, and there might be farther one downstream. So we want relative frequency, distance between the riffles divided by the width of the stream equals 5 to 7. So you're doing a little bit of math in your head. How many riffles do you see upstream and downstream divided by the width? And you're going to get a rough number, and that could give you the category you're looking for. This one should be fairly easy. I don't see any riffles, so this would probably be in the poor category. You don't see any more flowing water. There might be something up here. I don't know what's downstream, but this is not what we're looking for, and this is probably in the poor range, as opposed to this, where we have lots of different riffles, lots of different runs. Riffle frequency is comparable to the width, and this is really more of an optimal to suboptimal requirement. So channel flow status. This one's a little bit harder to determine because you need to be out this site at your site numerous times. Estimates the aerial extent of exposed substrate. What are the water levels? You have to know what the water level is. Is it going from bank to bank, or is it in low flow? If you're not out there all the time, you're not going to know those kind of things, and you're not going to realize that. So it can be problematic first couple times. You want stream riffles and cobble substrates not to be exposed. You want low gradient streams. The amount of water needs to go from, like I said, bank to bank, and does not have to have stagnant pools scored low. We want more substrate covered by water. Why is that? Well, there's more substrate covered by water. That means there's more areas for macros and fish to kind of hang out around. It's pretty easy to see once you see it, where this one goes from bank to bank. We have water. It seems to be filling the channel. You don't see too many issues. Where in this one, you can kind of see, excuse me, all these kind of open areas where the water just doesn't go. Like the stream is almost drying up. Once again, the base of both banks and minimal amount of channel substrate is what we're looking for here. If it only fills 75% or 25%, then we're getting it lower down in the range. This one, yeah, it's probably maybe the optimal to suboptimal. Yeah, there are some exposed banks here, but is that more the sediment deposition we talked about earlier, or is it just not the bank with the water filling both sides of the channel? Compared to something like this is more pronounced. Something has happened here. We have these large sediment bars, these issues along the edge here. So this is probably not something we want to see. And this is probably going to be in that poor to marginal category where the water just doesn't go from bank to bank. So we got through the first 8. Now we're on to the last 4 parameters, which apply to riffle run prevalence, evaluate even greater area. This area is usually defined as the length of the stream that was maybe electroshock for fish, and also take into consideration upstream land use activities in the watershed. So you're looking at not only your area, but also upstream and what's happening there. So we're looking at the conditions of the bank. I think we've all seen these. We're evaluating the extent of the bank failure, signs of erosion, potential for erosion, those kind of things. Steep banks are more likely to collapse than shallower banks, okay? Signs of erosion include crumbling, unvegetated banks, exposed tree roots, etc. Stable, non-eroding banks are usually optimal. Banks that have potential to erode are considered poor. I think we've all seen that. I mean, yeah, these banks are high on this optimal range, but they're stable. They got vegetation on, they're stable, they're not going anywhere, compared to something like this in the poor range, where banks are very open, bare, very easy chance to collapse in at some point. So banks are stable, no evidence of erosion. Are they moderately stable? Are they moderately unstable? And once again, grading those from left to right, from optimal to poor. Even in different types of the year, you can see a lot of this stuff, and it doesn't really prohibit you from going out in the winter months. So even here, we can see that these are fairly stable banks. There's not too much stuff going on. We don't see too many signs of erosion. So this, in my mind, would be more of an optimal to suboptimal environment. There's not too many issues here. Compared to a site like this, where we do have some visible erosion sources, you can kind of see sloughing off, some banks that have kind of fallen in over the time. So these are situations where this would be probably poor to marginal areas where we are going to have some issues. Bank vegetation, pretty self-explanatory. Estimate the extent of the stream bank that is covered by plant growth. As simple as that. Parameters supplied information on the ability of the bank to resist erosion. So if it's banks there, it's holding down that erosion. It's more effective by defining the native vegetation. Obviously, native is better than non-native shrubs, trees. We have to take into effect the invasive vegetation to the quality of the habitat and contribution. So just factor that in. Yes, there might be vegetation on there, but if it's all Japanese hops or it's all mile a minute or multiflora rose, that might not be the best vegetative cover for that particular bank. Pretty cut and dry example here in regards to optimal. You can see lots of vegetative cover on both sides as opposed to the poor range, which is basically a concrete channel. We want 90% of the bank surfaces covered by vegetation. That's the optimal range. If we have 70 to 90, it might be suboptimal. 50 to 70, marginal. Poor would be less than 50%. This is an example here. Yeah, there's vegetation here. It might not be the best. It might not be the widest buffer in the world, but it does have vegetation. So it might not be in the optimal, but it might be more of the lower end suboptimal or even higher end marginal category. Compared to something like this, where, yeah, there's vegetation, but it's all grass sod, which eroded banks, which are causing a lot of issues. So this one, in my mind, would be more toward the marginal. The vegetation they have there is really not holding things in place and causing more issues. So marginal poor would probably be this particular scoring system. Grazing or other disruptive pressures. Obviously, in Lancaster County, we have a lot of grazing pressure. So disruptions to surrounding land vegetation due to common human activities such as crop harvesting, lawn care, excavation, fill, construction, you name it. Obviously, the optimal would have none of that around there, and the poor would have some of those things around it. That's pretty easy to describe and show. Vegetative disruption is through grazing or mowing. So if we see any kind of grazing, mowing, any kind of disruption along the edge, it's probably not going to be in that optimal or suboptimal. It might be toward the marginal. We're looking for the areas that we're not, don't have that pressure on them. This would be a prime example. Even if this guy wasn't here mowing, we would see they were mowing down to the edge here, and probably not the most ideal situation. This would be a disruptive pressure. It would not score very high. Probably more in the the marginal to poor category. Where in relation to this, this to me doesn't look like there's any kind of pressure. I don't see any kind of livestock inclusion here or other things going on, mowing or weed whacking. So this might make them more optimal to suboptimal areas. Finally, we come to riparian vegetated zone. We want that to be as wide as possible. You got to estimate that. Narrow riparian buffers occur when roads, parking lots, and fields kind of encroach. Residential development, urban centers, you name it. Conversely, the presence of old field, previously developed field, not currently used paths and walkways can sometimes disturb that zones. So take that into a factor. If there's a trail going through there or some kind of thing, we need to factor that in. Look for wider riparian zones and look for the lack of human activity is really what it comes down to. This is what we're looking for, wide riparian buffer zones, where as opposed to encroachment from development of some sort, roads, infrastructure, you name it. With the riparian zone, we want it to be at least 18 meters. So significant 12 to 18 for suboptimal, 6 to 12 for marginal, and anything less than 6 meters, which is basically 18 feet, is really poor. This one might be the suboptimal to optimal. Yes, there's some concrete. We're on a bridge here, but it looks like it's fairly vegetated cover. Once again, we're looking for native cover. So if we see a lot of mile a minute or something like that, we might take that into a factor. Compared to something like this, where we don't have a lot of vegetated cover, because we have a shed, we have a baseball field, we have utilities. So we have to factor those kind of things in. The stream might be better, but optimal wise riparian vegetation zone might not be the best. So the synopsis of this habitat assessment is all the parameters in the matrix are evaluated, the scores are submitted, and you get a habitat score. There's a chapter in the assessment book that kind of goes into some of this stuff, and you can look that up. But it's really fairly easy to do. Just add those numbers up. And like I said, looking for a number above 140 would really indicate that we're hopefully headed in the right direction, habitat and macro wise. And hopefully then your biological assessment would also back that situation up. You would do this twice a year, usually in the spring or fall. It could be done in the summer or winter as well. It just might be a little harder to evaluate some of these things. And it is a subjective assessment. You have to keep that in mind. That's why it's always good to have numerous people doing this as opposed to just one. So you get kind of a team approach. One person might say suboptimal, the other person might say marginal, and you kind of split the difference and go right on the middle of either one of those. With that, the assessment is fairly easy and something that we here in Lancaster County can do fairly easily as well with our volunteers. So I would encourage you or others to maybe use this in your evaluation of local streams and creeks as maybe a precursor, kind of an event ahead of time to evaluate stream water quality, maybe without doing chemistry and biological, and maybe get a first glance or a cursory glance of that particular section of stream. As usual, if you have any questions, my contact information is on the site right now. Please look me up, ask any questions you might have, and be happy to answer those for you. With that, I will end the webinar or training session and bid you adieu, and thank you very much.